Hi, I'm Francesca Campoy, and this is Just for Funk. Welcome to episode number 20 of Just for Funk. Today, I'm going to go back to what you all love, and me too, which is code reviews. And I'm going to be code reviewing a URL shortener that someone sent to me. We will go through the code really quick, and then I'll start changing a lot of things. Does that sound fun? Let's get started. Cool. So the repo that we're going to be reviewing today is by Douglas Makey. I think that's how you pronounce it. And it's ursho or ursho. I'm not sure. It's a URL shortener. And it is pretty simple. It is basically an HTTP server that stores URLs in a Postgres database and every single time. So you can store new URLs, and then if you use the shortened version of that URL, will redirect you to the previous URL. So there's an example here that says, for instance, if you send this saying, okay, I want to create a shortened version of google.com, it will send you something like bn, well, with a prefix. And then if you access this, it will redirect you back to google.com. Also, there's an info URL that allows you to get the information, which contains the original URL, if this has been ever visited, and how many times. And that's everything we need to know for now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get that code. So I'm going to first get that URL that will download all the code. That was pretty fast. And then I'm going to go into that and open Visual Studio Code. Okay, so we have our main program. It creates some Postgres database. It reads some configuration, initializes the storage with a given configuration, then sets a lot of handlers, well, 3 of them, encode, info, and the one that redirects. And then in order to do graceful shutdown, it uses signals as we've done previously. So it creates a new channel and registers that channel with a signal package in order to get a value from that channel whenever there's a control C, control D, or actually not control D, control C, or even another kind of signal is sent. When that happens, what we do is we call server.shutdown, which will stop this listen and serve. And then there's a channel here close to basically get everything together to make sure that all of the things happen in the good order and that we wait until the server is actually shut down. Cool. So what else do? We have read config and read config. So we have this type here, type config, that has type server and Redis and Postgres and options. So those are the options for every single piece of the things. There's Redis that we are not using, but there's options there. Why not? But the important thing is that we have read config that returns a new config and an error and reads from this file. And that file contains this information in JSON. Cool. What else do we have? Let's go back to the main. So when we do storage init, okay, so this storage init is the one that actually connects to the database, creates a table if it doesn't exist, and then we have save, load, load info, and close. So those are the things that we can do with the database. And there's also an interface that explains this. So storages has an if storage, which is an interface, which I'm gonna assume that the person that wrote this used to write, I'm gonna guess C#, but I'm not completely sure. In any case, not very idiomatic, but it's fine. We'll fix that later. And basically that's a manager that allows you to store and retrieve URLs from the database. And then we have the handlers. And the handlers, we have the encode handler, we have the decode handler, and we have the redirect handler. And every single one of them, what we do is we pass storage, and it returns an HTTP handler. So the way we do that is returning a handler func, and all the code is inside. So that's pretty much everything this does. It's not incredibly complicated, which is good, And actually, I invite you to stop the video now, go have a look at the code, and see in what ways you would change it yourself. So pause the video. I will be here waiting for you, and then come back to watch the rest. And if not, don't read the code, just keep on playing the video, and you're gonna see a bunch of things that I'm going to change. Okay, so the first thing is this main.go. I'm not very happy with it for one simple reason, which is the way we're managing the graceful shutdown is more complicated than it needs to. So we have this go routine that is running listen and serve, and then this go routine that is waiting for something to happen, for that signal to arrive. Now the thing is that we then are waiting on this close to finish, but it doesn't make much sense because at the end of the day, that close, we're getting a channel from here, we're getting a value from here, from here, from here. This is actually really complicated, and there's no need to do it so complicated. So the way we're gonna do it is the running of the server is actually what counts. It is the important thing. So whenever this is done, we are actually done. So this doesn't need to be in a different routine. We're just going to simply put it at the end. And then the close channel is not necessary either, because what's going to happen is when we call shutdown, this listen and serve, actually there's two of them. I don't know why, so I'm just gonna drop one of them because there's no need to call listen and serve twice. Okay, so when we call server.shutdown, that will cause listen and serve to return with an error server closed. Also, the error will never be nil with listen and serve, so we can simply say if error is different to this, print the error, otherwise print that. This is also accurate. If the error is not error server closed, then something bad happened. Otherwise, we can just say server closed. Also, we can do this error. Okay, cool. So now with this, we can also move this part of the signal creation and everything inside of this go routine. Okay, so when we call server.shutdown, we need to pass a context. Passing nil is not a good idea, really not a good idea. So instead, we need to pass context.background. That will create a context that doesn't have any extra checks, so we will not have a timer, we will not have values, we will not have deadlines, but that's fine, but because it's still a valid context. Nil is not a valid context. Cool. Okay, so with that, our program is slightly simpler. I'm not going to get into how to log. I think that this is okay. I don't like. So when you want to log an error, it is easier to simply use printf. So that's what I'm going to do. Other than that, this looks pretty decent. So now we have a little bit of a better program, I would say. What else can we work on? Well, I'm not very happy with the read config either. Read config, the problem that it has right now is that, among other things, we do not know or cannot control where that config file is or how we read it, right? So right now, we're reading .config/config.json, right? What I want to do is the config package will have a function called, we could call it from file, for instance, that will read that instead, and it will return the rest. So now I'm going to say my config path is flag.string config. The default value is going to be that path. So that is default value path of the config file. And then we need to do flag.parse to make sure we actually take that into account. And then we can do config.fromFile config path. So another good thing is that since we're declaring this flag, if we run the binary -h, we will see that config is the option, what is the default value, etc. So it's added to the documentation in a way that it makes it really easy for anyone using the binary to figure out how to fix it. Okay, what else do we have in this from file? So this from file is actually unnecessarily complicated. What we're doing is opening a file, then deferring the close, then we copy the file to a buffer, and then we get the bytes. So all of this code is actually the same as IOUtil read file of path. That will return some bytes. If the error is not nil, we're gonna return nil, and say we can return the error directly. And now the unmarshal can be simply the bytes. So this is still the same. I can move this here. And the object config, I'm just gonna call it config and use config and return config. Okay, so this does exactly the same, and I'd say this is way simpler. Cool. We should document this, but I'm not going to. Something else that you could do is you could unify all of these types into one. Right now, there's a lot of types that do not necessarily add much. So you could say that, for instance, the server is directly used here. So the server is a struct that has the host and the port, right? You could do the same thing for Redis. You can do the same thing for Postgres. You can do the same thing for options. This is the same, and the good thing is that then you can document less things. So config contains the configuration of the URL shortener, and from file return configuration parsed from the given file. Cool. We also need to document the package itself, but that's up to you. I'll leave it as an exercise to the watcher. Sure, to the watcher. Does this still work? No, it doesn't, and it doesn't because we're using config from somewhere else, which is interesting. Okay, so we have our handler, and handler config read config. We are in the init function. We're reading the config, which we cannot do anymore because the flag will have not been parsed yet. So we cannot just add the flag in here, which is a little bit of a problem. But why are we doing this? We're doing it to get the prefix. Cool. So, and then the prefix is being used. Let's find all the references. It's only used here once. Let's see where. Whoops. It's being used in this encode handler. I'm going to simply pass prefix as a parameter here, which means that I can come back to base, remove this prefix, remove all of this init, and go back to main, and we need to pass here config.options.prefix. Okay, so now we're passing the prefix from the main function to the handler. And now that should make it work. Cool. Now we have something a little bit better. Let's see what we had in base.go. So in base.go, what we have is apparently all of these handlers, they call create response because they pass a response with data and a success boolean, and it just prints that to the output by doing JSON marshal. And it panics if something goes wrong. That's not very good. So let's work on the handlers now. The way the handlers are defined right now, I am not very happy with them because we are passing these parameters all of the time. Well, not all the time, but for every single handler, and then returning an HTTP handler. Rather than doing that, I'd say that it may be easier to define a type that holds the storage, and the prefix, and then the handlers will be methods of that type. Let me see what I mean. So I'm going to define type, prefix, and string, and storage is a storages.iStorage. We'll change that soon, do not worry. Okay, and then here it's going to be method of handler is going to be this thing, so we can get rid of all of this. Okay, so now our method, what it's doing is reading the prefix from h.prefix and storage from h.storage, right? So rather than receiving them as parameters and creating a closure, what we do is we get them directly from the receiver of the method. Cool. What other things can we change here? This is really ugly. If the method is not the good one, then we should do what we call early return or early termination, where we're going to do the short thing first and then return. We removed a level of indentation, which is always good. So if the method is not post, then just write the header status method not allowed and exit. Otherwise, continue doing whatever you were doing. Cool. What else can we change in here? So create response right now, the way it works is just panics. I'm not very happy with that. We'll change that later, but for now, let's work on changing the other methods. So again, rather than being a function that returns a function, we're gonna make a method, and this will be h.storage. This will be here at the beginning, early termination where possible. Cool. We're gonna leave it for now like that, and here h handler is so this again is gonna be a method. We can remove this part. We're gonna do early termination, which drops all of this. Okay, and then h.storage. Cool, so now just with this, we've made our code way simpler to follow. There's not that many functions returning functions doing complicated things, which is always nice. Let's see how these are used. So now if we save this will not work. We're going to need to do something like define this as an exported type. Let's see if that works. Nope, didn't work. I'm gonna do it manually. Let me move this. Okay, so we have handler, handler, and handler. Cool. So we're going to create a handlers.handler that contains a prefix. It's going to be config.options.prefix, and storage is going to be storage. And that's going to be our handler. And here we're going to use those names as now methods, so that will have the correct type, hopefully, except that this is prefix, this storage. So this is storage, this is prefix, this is storage, and this is storage. Okay, you happy now? Okay, that looks a little bit better. So what we're doing is we are defining a handler value, and then the method encode handler can be passed like this without calling it, and that will have the type of a function which actually matches handler func, which is perfect. That's exactly what we want. This is a little bit better. But I'm still not happy. And I'm still not happy because this information should not be on the in the main package. I think this should be part of the handlers package. So I'm going to remove this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide most of this information in a new function. And that new function is the only one that we're going to expose, and it will return an HTTP handler. We're gonna pass the two parameters we were using before, so the prefix and the storage, which is storages.ifStorage, and this will return a handler like this. So return a handler. Return. Okay, let's comment this out. And this will not work because it's saying, oh, to start with, this should be prefix. But this still doesn't work because it says it doesn't implement the handler interface because it's missing serve HTTP, which totally makes sense. Instead of making that implement the right interface, we're not going to return that handler. We're going to define a new servmux. And this servmux is similar to when we do HTTP handle func. We are using the default servmux, but we can create our own servmux. And now I can do these lines here. So I can do H, 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 and mux. Let's see if that is happy. That is not happy. Oh, wait. Doesn't implement. Oh, handle func, sorry. Handle func, handle func, handle func. Okay, so now we have pretty much the same thing and we can return the mux. So now with this, what we've done is we've been able to put the logic about how URLs are served inside of the handlers package, which in my opinion makes a lot of sense. So now we can make this type private with private fields, so private, not exported. So this is going to be handler, this is going to be handler. This is going to be back to storage, back to storage, back to prefix, back to storage. Cool. And this is going to be handler. Now we can remove this because this is private and nobody cares. It's only us can see that anymore. Cool. So now we have a new function. So from here we can simply do HTTP serve everything with handlers.new of prefix and storage. And prefix is actually config.options.prefix. Cannot use HTTP handle, not HTTP serve. So now what we're saying is handle all the things with the handler that you receive from the handlers package, which if you say something /encode will call encode handler. Now, since this is a little bit repetitive, I'm going to change the names to encode, redirect, and the code. So this is going to be encode, this is going to be the code, and this is going to be redirect. So let's see, does this compile? Awesome. So let's save it. And then we can document just this function because this is now the only part that of the whole package that is exported, which is nice. What else do we have in base? Okay, so we have create response and response itself. And response is interesting, so we're going to keep it in handlers. But this create response, I'd say it's not useful at all. So I'm just going to delete it and also delete base.go. So now we have only one package. When I do that, all of a sudden I break a lot of things. So create response I'm just going to edit all of them at the same time. What we can do is just ignore the error, the possible error of trying to encode something into the output by just doing new encoder into the output and then encode E. So this is actually exactly the same thing as before. It is not better. Well, I'd say it's a little bit better. Maybe not, because before it was panicking and now it's failing silently. We will fix that later. What about that response? The response type does not need to be exported because we don't really care about it that much. Instead, what we're going to do is we just encode it, right? So there's not really a point on having that response type being exported. Nobody is going to see it. Then success and data. Actually, those two need to be exported because otherwise the JSON package will not be able to see them, so it will not encode them. So be careful with that. Okay. What about the body request? Body request is used only once. So what I'm going to do is just simply use it there. One type less, right? This is exactly the same as we had before, but I like this a little bit better because it is very clear that nobody else is going to use this. Actually, I'm going to change the name of the variable because B is maybe not that clear. We getting the URL. I'm gonna call it URL. If the URL is empty, we're going to create an error and return it. Otherwise, we're going to save that URL. What else can we improve? Well, there's a lot of pretty repetitive things, right? Like this write header, create a response, and then encode it. Write header, create response, encode it. Write header, create response, encode it. And so on and so on. So I'm going to create something that does exactly that. Now, there's a couple of ways of doing it. One of them is you could simply create a function that does this. So you pass in the parameters here. Instead of doing that, and just because that way, so if I define a function, let's go to the first one that does it, right? I could define a function, let's call it send response, that does HTTP status error. Then it sends the response, and then sends, yeah, that's it. So we could do something like this, right? But then I still need to do return at the end. Let's imagine that that function existed. We still need to do this return here. And if we forget about it, then we will have a bug because we will continue. So instead, what I want to do is I want this thing here to return the values of the response. Let me show you what I mean by that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to return, let's say that we're going to return, what is data? Data is an empty interface. Okay, so I'm going to return an empty interface. I'm going to return the status that we want to return and also an error. So when we have status method not allowed, we're going to return nothing. Status method not allowed. And the error is going to be status method method not allowed. And we can do r.method. So now we can remove this one. In this case, we can do return also nil, internal server error, and then this. And that makes me think that a couple things. One is this could be simply error like this. But also, if we're not able to decode something, that is not internal server error. That is status bad request. Cool. And then here we return, again, nothing. We return bad request and funct rf URL, whoops, URL is empty. And finally here, not finally, but almost there, we return bad request and the error. I don't like sending errors without more context, so I'm going to add some. Could not store in database, which is a bad idea from a security point of view. It'd be better not to show this to the user, because you might be leaking information that you don't want to. But in this case, I'm just gonna do it this way. Normally, what I would do is I would log the error with all the details and just send something going like, "Oops, something went wrong." Cool. And okay, and now finally, we're going to be returning this data. We need to return a status. In this case, I'd say that probably what we want to call it is status created, because we created something in the database, and then no error. Cool. Okay, so this is a little bit easier to follow, right? And now what we need to do is actually use this somehow, because right now this doesn't work anymore. So I'm gonna call it response handler, and this response handler, what it's going to do, let's define it here for now. So response handler is given a function that does all of this. So given a function of this type, returns an HTTP handler func. So let's do that handler func. And that handler func, the way this is going to work is it's going to call whatever we passed it with W and R, and it's going to get the data, the status, and the error. If the error is not nil, we'll set that the data is going to be the message of the error. We are going to write the header is going to be status, and then we're going to, what else? So we're going to encode new encoder into W, encode data, and actually not encode data, but encode response, where data is data and the success is errors equals nil. This is exactly the same, because if the error equals nil, then it's success. Actually, I would not use success. Instead, I would trust the error code on the status code on the HTTP response to tell me that information. But I want to keep the URLs, I want to keep the API working exactly as before. So that's why I'm going to keep it exactly like that. Okay, and if the error is not nil, we should probably log printf, we could not encode to the output. Could not encode to output. Could not encode response to output. Let's try to write messages that make sense. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the code. So the code's going to also return an empty interface, an integer and an error. And here is going to return, so nil, method not allowed, and method not allowed. Method are the method not allowed. Not happy, error F. Okay, here we're going to return nil, status not found, and URL not found. And here we're going to return the model. We're going to return HTTP status OK and no error. Cool. What about redirect? So we could do the same thing for redirect, but this does not really return a response. So it is different enough that there's no point on using that adapter. And this is why I'm always a little bit concerned about big frameworks, or like big frameworks that force you to do things in a specific way, because it is always easy to find a case that doesn't really match that use case. Cool. So what else can we do? Well, this we're doing it everywhere in those two encode and decode. So I'm going to move that there. And what else? I would say the response writer could be a writer instead, because we're not doing anything special with it. We're not using the headers anymore. And it makes it even simpler for us to write tests if we wanted. And it still works. Cool. And I think that this is a pretty decent code now. And now that the handlers package is pretty good, I'd say that it's time to go work with the storages package. Let's do that.